The crystal chandelier shivered above the grand ballroom, threatening to topple as the bride's designer heels clicked across the polished marble floor. Guests whispered behind their fans and champagne glasses, but the clamor of excitement could not mask the tension that pulsed like electricity in the room. The young bride, Victoria, strutted ahead, her silk gown swaying with every confident step. She laughed, high-pitched and sharp, not at a joke, but at the fear she sensed she instilled in everyone around her. In that moment, the butler, Nathan, quietly adjusted the heavy drapery that had slipped during the commotion, his movements precise and calm, unseen but entirely essential. Victoria's handmaidens gasped as a tray of champagne teetered dangerously on a side table. Before anyone could shout, Nathan darted forward, steadying the tray with a practiced hand. The glasses wobbled but did not fall. A hush of awe ran through a few attentive guests. "My word," murmured an elderly relative, eyes widening. Nathan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and stepped back into the shadows. Victoria, oblivious, flicked her eyes toward him, annoyed at the interruption of her perfect display. "Everything must be perfect tonight," she hissed to her groom, Alexander, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. He smiled nervously, adjusting his bow tie as if trying to hide the anxiety that rippled through him. Nathan had observed the small smirk that betrayed Alexander's doubts. He had noticed the subtle missteps, the tiny cracks in the evening's facade. And he knew, as he always did, that no amount of silk or gold could mask human folly. The first toast began. Guests lifted their glasses, eyes glittering with expectation. Victoria's voice rang clear and commanding, a rehearsed melody of charm and entitlement. To love, to luxury, and to a future as bright as this room. The glasses clinked, but one trembled slightly on the edge of a silver platter. Nathan's eyes flicked instinctively toward it, calculating, and he moved his hand before it tipped. Relief passed through a few unsuspecting guests, invisible to Victoria, who continued her performance with a radiant, dismissive smile. Alexander leaned closer to Nathan at a quiet moment behind the curtains. "Do you think she even notices you?" he asked, voice low, tinged with admiration and helplessness. Nathan only shook his head, eyes fixed on the bride as she paraded near the center stage of attention. "It doesn't matter if she notices," Nathan replied, calm and firm. "What matters is that tonight doesn't collapse because someone couldn't control her ego." A loud crash split the room. One of the floral arrangements had toppled, sending petals and water cascading across the polished floor. Victoria squealed in irritation, flailing her gloved hands. Gasps and whispers swept through the crowd. Nathan moved without hesitation, lifting the vase with ease and repositioning the flowers in one fluid motion. Not a single guest suspected the near disaster that had passed. Victoria, her eyes flashing, misinterpreted his action as an intrusion. "Watch where you step," she snapped, voice cutting. But Nathan only inclined his head slightly and returned to his duties. Guests began murmuring, noticing the calm precision of the butler amid chaos. A little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, who is that man? He's everywhere fixing things." The mother smiled faintly, understanding the quiet genius behind the composed exterior. Nathan overheard, but said nothing. That was the way of the world. People noticed, people admired, but they did not intervene or disturb. The butler's brilliance thrived in the shadows, unseen yet crucial. Victoria's smile faltered slightly when she caught the fleeting look of admiration from the crowd directed at Nathan. She tightened her jaw and clutched her bouquet more firmly, determined not to let the attention stray. "Everything is as it should be," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Alexander's hand brushed hers, offering a timid reassurance. But he, too, had begun to notice the subtle truth. The true hero of the night was not the woman commanding the room, but the man moving quietly behind her, preventing catastrophe at every turn. Dinner began, and the chatter of guests filled the air. Nathan glided from table to table, refilling glasses, noticing the small inconsistencies, and rectifying them before they became noticeable. Victoria noticed him moving efficiently, her smile growing tighter, more strained. "Nathan, see that everything is perfect," she barked, as though the orders might reveal her awareness of his superior skills. Nathan simply nodded, eyes calm, his hands steady. He would ensure the night's grandeur without drawing attention, for recognition was never his goal. A minor disaster arose again. A candle tipped dangerously close to the centerpiece. Nathan's hand shot forward, steadying it in a seamless motion. Guests barely realized what had almost happened. Alexander, seeing the sequence, whispered under his breath, "How does he do it?" Nathan's eyes flicked toward him, a subtle smirk forming. "Practice and patience," he murmured, voice barely audible. Victoria had begun to fume internally. Her control slipping, she stomped toward a guest table to correct a perceived slight, nearly toppling a chair in her rush. Nathan intercepted it with a swift movement, steadying the furniture without breaking his calm. The guests began noticing the quiet rhythm, the disasters averted, the chaos tamed, all by the man in the background. Whispers of admiration grew louder, and a few bold glances toward the butler could not be ignored. By dessert, the tension had grown unbearable. Victoria's brilliance in commanding attention was being overshadowed, not by another bride, not by an entertainer, but by a butler who had done nothing more than his duty, flawlessly. Alexander, sitting beside her, finally leaned close. "Maybe you should notice him," he said softly. Victoria's eyes snapped toward him, incredulous. "Notice him? Why would I?" she began, but words faltered as she caught sight of the smile that the crowd now quietly shared, directed at Nathan. The final act approached, the ceremonial cutting of the wedding cake. Victoria had rehearsed her speech, her movements, every possible detail. Nathan, ever observant, noticed a small structural crack in the cake stand that no one else had seen. One wrong move, and the centerpiece would topple. Without hesitation, he adjusted the base, steadying it before the crowd could perceive the danger. The cake remained pristine. Victoria's breath caught, realizing at last that someone had prevented a catastrophe without her awareness. Her dominance was quietly undermined, and the admiration of the guests no longer followed her every move. A small applause rose when the first slice was cut flawlessly. Nathan stepped back, blending into the shadows, unnoticed but essential. Alexander caught his gaze, nodding subtly in gratitude. The bride, however, could no longer maintain her composed facade. Panic flickered in her eyes as she realized the crowd's subtle shift. The story of the night belonged not to her, but to the man who had orchestrated perfection behind the scenes. At that moment, Nathan caught the glance of a young child sitting at a corner table. The girl's eyes sparkled with admiration, her hands clapping quietly. He nodded to her with a small, gentle smile, the first outward sign of personal acknowledgement for the evening. Victoria's frustration bubbled over. Her face hardened, jaw tight, but the seeds of humility had been planted. Alexander leaned back, a soft chuckle escaping him, realizing that the wedding's success owed more to the butler than the bride herself. Midway through the evening, Nathan quietly approached Alexander. "Everything is running smoothly now," he said, voice calm, almost intimate. "But she doesn't yet realize who truly holds tonight together." Alexander smiled faintly, shaking his head in awe. Nathan's hands, steady and precise throughout the night, had prevented more disasters than anyone could count. And yet, he remained in the background, the quiet hero of a night that Victoria had believed she controlled entirely. The guests began to notice subtle nuances, the way decorations never wavered, the way the chairs were perfectly aligned, the seamless flow of service. Whispers passed between tables, curiosity growing. Who was that man? He seems to be everywhere. Nathan's calm demeanor did not change. A hero does not seek attention. He simply acts, and tonight, his actions were undeniable. As the night drew toward its finale, a sudden flicker of light revealed a small spill near the dance floor. Victoria froze, panic returning, but Nathan was already moving. In one smooth motion, he cleaned it, repositioned the lighting, and ensured the floor was pristine before anyone else could notice. The tension in the room lifted silently. Victoria, watching him work, felt the first pangs of recognition, not admiration, but irritation at her own loss of control. Alexander, smiling softly, leaned close again. "You may not see it now, but he's outshined you tonight," he murmured. Victoria's eyes narrowed, but she could not argue with the truth before her. Nathan, once more unnoticed, allowed himself a fleeting smirk. The night would end with laughter, applause, and admiration. But the real hero had already been acknowledged quietly by those who truly understood his worth. "Remember to like, comment, and subscribe," Alexander whispered jokingly to a guest nearby, though the words seemed prophetic for Nathan's unrecognized yet heroic role. The music swelled as the first dance began. Victoria took Alexander's hand, swirling across the floor with practiced elegance. Guests clapped politely, but their eyes wandered repeatedly to Nathan, who moved with quiet precision behind the scenes. Every light adjustment, every subtle alignment of furniture, every discreet correction of a misstep on the polished floor, he was everywhere without being seen. Victoria noticed, her confidence faltering as whispers of admiration grew louder in the crowd. A minor mishap struck again. The spotlight faltered, threatening to illuminate the wrong corner of the dance floor. Victoria froze mid-step, panic flashing across her perfect face. Nathan, moving with the calm of a seasoned conductor, adjusted the rigging silently, and the lighting returned to flawless warmth. The crowd noticed nothing. Alexander, watching, leaned closer to Victoria, murmuring, "See? Not everything is about appearances." Her lips pressed into a thin line, realizing with an uncomfortable twist that the truth behind the night's perfection was not her doing. Guests began to murmur among themselves, subtly nodding toward Nathan. A few bold individuals whispered praise. "He's incredible, so calm, everything perfect." The aura of admiration began to shift subtly, the power in the room quietly moving away from the bride toward the butler. Victoria's smile stiffened, her grip on Alexander's arm tightening as if to remind herself who she was supposed to be. But the subtle recognition in everyone's gaze was undeniable. The first dance ended, and the guests dispersed to the buffet and lounge areas. Victoria excused herself to check on last-minute details. Nathan, ever vigilant, noticed the bride's designer hairpiece teetering precariously as she adjusted her gown. Before it could fall, he stepped lightly, catching it and setting it perfectly. She froze, looking at him sharply. I didn't see you there." Nathan only inclined his head politely and walked away, calm and unshaken. At the dessert table, chaos threatened again. A tiered wedding cake, taller than most guests, wobbled dangerously. Victoria gasped, stepping forward instinctively, only for Nathan to intervene with perfect timing. One smooth adjustment, and the cake stood stable. Guests gasped softly, realizing that yet another near disaster had been averted without fanfare. Victoria's composure slipped for the first time. She realized she had been powerless in moments where she had assumed control. A young flower girl approached Nathan hesitantly. "Sir, you're amazing," she whispered, eyes wide with admiration. Nathan crouched slightly, smiling gently. "Thank you, little one," he said. She giggled and ran back to her seat. Alexander, witnessing this brief exchange, felt a surge of gratitude and relief. Nathan's humility and competence had quietly saved the entire night from disaster after disaster. The final toast approached. Glasses were raised, voices joined in celebration, but Victoria's eyes darted repeatedly to Nathan. She was beginning to understand the truth. The man she had ignored, dismissed, and underestimated had carried the weight of her perfect facade on his shoulders. Alexander, sensing her dawning realization, squeezed her hand. "Notice him," he said softly, not cruelly, but with the honesty she had refused to see all night. Victoria's lips parted, but words failed her. She had rehearsed every line, every movement for perfection, yet here was a man with no claims, no flamboyance, no entitlement, and still, he had outshone her at every turn. Guests clinked their glasses, and many subtle nods were cast toward Nathan, acknowledgement flowing silently but unmistakably. He met a few of these gazes with the quietest of smiles, acknowledging appreciation without arrogance. The night's music shifted to the lively final dance. Guests laughed, couples twirled, and yet the true story of the night was clear to those paying attention. The butler had been the silent orchestrator, the unsung hero of the evening. Victoria's confidence wavered as she noticed the admiration on the faces of the guests around her. Even those she had assumed were devoted to her beauty and status now exchanged glances of respect for Nathan. A sudden incident threatened to undo the night's careful balance. A table of champagne bottles tipped, sending liquid cascading toward the guests' feet. Gasps echoed. Victoria, frozen, realized she could not reach it in time. Nathan, almost faster than the eye could track, was already there, lifting the bottles, adjusting the glasses, and ensuring no one slipped. Relief swept through the crowd, and a few bold guests whispered, "He's amazing. Everything's perfect." Victoria's jaw tightened, humiliation and begrudging respect mingling in her eyes. Alexander approached Nathan quietly. "Thank you," he murmured. "I don't think anyone realizes how much you've saved tonight." Nathan's calm, subtle smile met his gaze. "It's nothing extraordinary," he replied softly. "I just do what needs to be done." But Alexander knew better. He had witnessed the countless moments of near disaster Nathan had quietly prevented. As the night drew to its finale, Victoria finally confronted Nathan. "I don't understand, how did you?" Her words faltered. Nathan met her gaze evenly. "I simply ensured that what needed to succeed did. No more, no less," he said, calm and measured. The crowd noticed the tension, but Nathan's demeanor remained flawless. Victoria realized she could not compete, not with wealth, not with beauty, not with the power she had assumed she held. The man she had overlooked had proven his worth in quiet, undeniable acts. The final song played. Alexander extended his hand to Victoria, but she hesitated, seeing the subtle admiration Nathan received from every corner of the ballroom. Even the guests' smiles were tinged with recognition for him. In that moment, Victoria's arrogance began to crack, replaced with humility she had never experienced before. Nathan, ever modest, adjusted a stray napkin on a table, smiled briefly, and stepped back into the shadows. As the guests departed, a few approached Nathan to offer thanks and congratulations. A child's voice called softly, "You were amazing tonight." Nathan bent slightly, smiling warmly. "Thank you, little one. That means a lot." Alexander approached, clapping him on the shoulder. "Truly remarkable," he said. Nathan nodded, quietly acknowledging the recognition without pride. Victoria stood alone for a moment, watching the butler as he disappeared quietly into the background. Her mind churned with realization. She had been outshined, not by another bride, not by wealth, not by status, but by humility, skill, and quiet competence. Alexander leaned closer, whispering, "Sometimes, the ones who do the most are the ones we never see." She could not argue. The truth was undeniable. The mansion lights dimmed, music softened, and Nathan quietly walked down the grand hall, unnoticed by most but remembered by a few. The night had been saved, not by glamour, wealth, or entitlement, but by a quiet man who understood what needed to be done. His actions had changed the night, outshone the bride, and earned silent admiration that would linger long after the last guest had departed. As the final words of the night echoed through the hall, Alexander leaned to a guest and whispered, "Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, because stories like this remind us that heroes don't always wear crowns." Nathan, overhearing, smiled faintly, acknowledging the wisdom of the statement. He had done his duty, changed the course of the night, and reminded everyone present that true value lies in actions, integrity, and quiet courage. Victoria, humbled and thoughtful, finally understood that no display of wealth or power could compare to the subtle strength of someone who acts without expectation, without recognition, simply because it is right. The butler, Nathan, had not only saved a wedding but had also silently taught a lesson in true worth, loyalty, and the quiet power of humility. The guests would remember the grandeur, the laughter, and the music, but those who had observed carefully would remember the man who had outshone the bride. The moral was clear. The ones who quietly work behind the scenes often leave the most lasting impact. Nathan stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting in his calm eyes. The mansion behind him glowed warmly, the echoes of the night's events fading into memory. He had done more than his duty. He had ensured that truth, skill, and kindness triumphed over vanity and pride. And in the quiet, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The story closed, but the lesson remained. True heroes are often unseen, but their actions ripple far beyond the eyes of those who notice.